Hey friends, we come again today to Romans 5:12 to 21. And here's the big question we're going to try to solve. In what way has Adam's sin affected the human race? Okay? In what way has Adam's sin affected the human race? Now, people have tried to understand the answer to that question in three different ways. One answer is that it hasn't affected the human race at all. Those who hold to this position would say, well, the only way that Adam's sin has affected the human race is that it is given a bad example. So Adam provided a bad example, but that's it. So that is the position of a man named Pelagius. He was a monk, a British monk in the 4th and 5th centuries. The second way that Christians have tried to answer this question is they say that Adam has transmitted a sinful nature to the human race. In other words, he has transmitted corruption. He's transmitted to all people this inclination towards sin. Now, they would say guilt is not transmitted to the human race, but this corruption is. So a sinful nature. And then a third group of Christians would say this: Adam has transmitted not only a sinful nature, but also guilt to the entire human race. Now, which one of those three positions, if any of them, did the Apostle Paul teach? We're in Romans 5:12 to 21, so let's look at a couple verses to see if we can deduce what Paul believed about this subject. So Romans 5:19 says this: For as through the one man's disobedience, the many were made sinners, even so, through the obedience of the one, that's Christ, the many will be made righteous. And from this verse, I understand that Paul was teaching that Adam passed down to his ancestors a fallen, sinful nature, because through the one man's disobedience, the many were made or constituted sinners. Now, a sinner is one who sins. And so through the one man's disobedience, the many were made people who sinned. We were born in sin, the Bible says, shaped in iniquity. We go astray from birth, speaking lies. When Adam sinned, God thought of the entire human race that proceeded from him as being sinners. So I believe I believe Romans 5:19 teaches that Adam passed down his moral corruption, his inclination to sin, a sinful nature to all of those that descended from him. Number two, let's look at Romans 5:18. This verse says this: So then, as through one transgression there resulted condemnation to all men. Now, the word condemnation is really the opposite of the word justification. So condemnation is the judicial act of declaring a person guilty, culpable of wrongdoing. So through one transgression, through Adam's transgression, the Bible says there resulted condemnation, or the judicial act of declaring one guilty, and that was passed on all people. So this text says that Adam's transgression resulted in all men being declared guilty before God. So my conclusion from these verses is that both of these things were passed down from Adam to all people, both a sinful nature and inherited guilt. We are guilty of Adam's transgression, and we inherit his inclination towards sin. But why should we really believe that all people are guilty of Adam's transgression? Right? That doesn't seem fair when you think about it. Well, Adam did that, not me. Why am I being held responsible, guilty of doing what I didn't do? He did it, not me, right? That goes through our minds. Well, let's take a look at how Paul puts this in Romans 5:12 to 14. He says, Therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. He's going to go off on a little bit of a rabbit trail here. He's going to explain what he just meant by all sinned. Paul, what do you mean all sinned? Okay, here it goes. For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law. Nevertheless, how do we know that sin was in the world even before the law was given? Here he tells us, nevertheless, death reigned from Adam until Moses, even over those who had not sinned in the likeness of the offense of Adam, who is a type of him who was to come. So verse 12 says, death spread to all men because all sinned. We know that the wages of sin is death. We know that all people die. Why do all people die? Is it because of their own individual personal acts of sin? I don't think so. I think that's part of it. But another major part of it is the fact that all people receive death because they sinned when Adam sinned. They sinned in Adam. And that's what Paul's getting at here. All sinned when Adam sinned. So Paul goes on to explain his meaning in verses 13 and 14. Until the law, Paul says, sin was in the world. So from creation all the way up until Moses, hundreds of years later, sin was in the world. How do we know sin was in the world? Because everybody died during that time period, and death is the result of sin. So sin was still in the world, but there was no law. And Paul says sin is not imputed when there is no law. So if people are still dying, but yet sin is not imputed because there's no law to break, why are they dying? Paul's answer, they sinned in Adam. They are held accountable and responsible for the sin that Adam committed. That sin, the imputation of that sin is being put to their account, and they are responsible. Okay, and then even babies during this time period were dying, right? In the flood, no doubt there were many babies. During the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, when God rained down fire from heaven, no doubt there were infants included. But those infants had not committed any individual personal acts of sin yet against knowledge. They hadn't done that, but yet they still died. Why? I think Paul's answer would be because they sinned in Adam. See, Adam was a public person. That's how Matthew Henry calls him. A public person, a representative, like our president. If our president declares war, then every person in the United States also is going to war with that country. We can't help it. Our president has made a decision on our behalf and in our stead. And because he represents us, we also are committed to the same action that he has decided on. So I would just ask you to give all of this some thought today. If you've never thought deeply about how Adam's sin affects all humanity, give that some thought. Look over the scriptures in Romans chapter 5 and see what you can conclude and come to. In fact, I would encourage you just to share your thoughts in the comments below. Maybe we can dialogue about this. And on our next video, we're going to tackle the really tough question is, isn't it unfair for God to hold me responsible for Adam's transgression? That's the natural question we've all got. Let's dig into that. Let's see what we can come up with as we talk together next time. God bless.